Ladies and gentlemen, if I might have your attention. Bonjour et bienvenue à Fredericton. I'm Barry Craig, Vice President Academic, St. Thomas University. It's my pleasure to welcome you both to Congress 2011 and to this, the first of our Big Thinkers series. Aristotle observes in the Ethics that the good life for a human being involves both intellectual activity and social activity. At its best, Congress, I think, is a combination of the two. We come, we make friendships, we develop friendships of the past, and we build intellectual community. And the second half of that is that we come for the exchange and consideration of ideas. With the Big Thinkers series, and particularly today with our distinguished guest, I think we set the right tone for this Congress. Many of you are acquainted one with another, and in the days to come, you will make new friendships. Today, with Kwame Anthony Appiah, we have one of the and courageous. This is, for me, a personal pleasure to be able for him to speak, and I'm sure it will be for all of you. And now I would call upon Dr. Rod MacDonald.
Good afternoon and welcome to this big thinking lecture by Dr. Kwame Appiah. Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à cette causerie voix grande du professeur Kwame Appiah. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Appiah today. The Royal Society of Canada is extremely pleased to partner with the Federation in co-sponsoring this lecture. Indeed, we take special pleasure in supporting a lecture by a distinguished humanist with a broad, pluridisciplinary understanding of the challenges facing contemporary institutions like the university, as they seek to develop a cogent set of narratives to explain that their civic and cultural significance and that of their authors and scholars affiliated with them. Le Dr. Appiah est actuellement titulaire de la chaire Lawrence S. Rockefeller à l'Université Princeton et également président du conseil d'administration du Conseil américain des sociétés savantes. Il a enseigné, entre autres, aux universités de Ghana, à Columbia, Cornell, Yale et Harvard. Il nous fait grand plaisir de coopérer cette causerie qui, de par son sujet, reflète fidèlement la vision, la mission et le mandat de la Société royale du Canada, reconnaître, promouvoir, conseiller. As a society whose fellowship spans the arts, the humanities, the social sciences, and the physical sciences, we are proud to co-sponsor this big thinking lecture by an intellectual whose extraordinary career and life trajectory as a scholar and novelist reflects eloquently the Society's motto, Studiis eodem diversis nitimo. Dr. Appiah.
Bonjour, chers collègues. C'est un très grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous et à partir de ce moment, je parlerai en anglais. It is a great pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to have been invited. I spent last night in the Beaverbrook Hotel, which brought back many conversations with my grandmother because my grandfather preceded Lord Beaverbrook as Lord Privy Seal and followed him as Minister of Aircraft Production during the Second World War in the United Kingdom. In looking back, in the current circumstances of anxiety about intellectual property, I should say this is a quote. In looking back on the great works of genius in former times, we're sometimes disposed to wonder at the little progress which has been made in poetry and in the arts of imitation in general. That's William Hazlitt in his lectures on English poetry, delivered in 1818. His subject was the poetry of Shakespeare and Milton, and the puzzle he was dealing with is surely a real one. Why was modern poetry not obviously superior to the works of these two older English poets in the way that so many other things in his day, from politics to medicine to the physical sciences, so clearly were superior to their Elizabethan and Restoration counterparts? The heart of Hazlitt's answer to this question is encapsulated in the three sentences that follow. What is mechanical, reducible to rule, or capable of demonstration is progressive and admits of gradual improvement. What is not mechanical or definite but depends on feeling, taste, and genius very soon becomes stationary or retrograde and loses more than it gains by transfusion. The contrary opinion is a vulgar error which has grown up, like many others, from transferring an analogy of one kind to something quite distinct, without taking into account the difference in the nature of the things or attending to the difference of the results. For most persons, finding what wonderful advances have been made, and here's his wonderful list of sciences, in biblical criticism, in chemistry, in mechanics, in geometry, astronomy, etc., i.e., in the things depending on mere inquiry and experiment or on absolute demonstration, have been led hastily to conclude that there was a general tendency in the efforts of the human intellect to improve by repetition, and in all other arts and institutions to grow perfect and mature by time. Now, I'll return later to Hazlitt's answer and to some thoughts of my own about his question, but let me point out first that in an age of magnificent progress in the sciences, we humanists have to be able to answer a different question, one very like Hazlitt's and connected to it. The knowledge we acquire, the learning we transmit, the traditions we inherit and study and value, presuppose the continuing pertinence to our society here and now of human artifacts made by others long and not so long ago, and far and not so far away. Now, Shakespeare would be an unreliable guide to contemporary politics. Aristotle is an obstacle to our understanding of biology. Even Newton's Principia can be safely ignored by the modern student of physics. So why do humanists return to the past if what we seek is the truth? If Hazlitt's answer is right, then one reason some of these objects remain worthy of our attention is that they have a kind of excellence that has not been superseded. And that would help with our question, since I don't think our civilization is so degraded that we have to defend giving attention to what is excellent. But accepting Hazlitt's claim that the arts are not progressive would not be enough to defend the continuing relevance of the humanistic study of the past. For by the humanities, clearly, we mean more than Hazlitt meant by poetry and the arts of imitation. We mean, to begin with, as I've recently suggested, not just, or not so much, the practice, but the study of these, and also the study of the widest range of the cultural artifacts of human civilizations, past and present, including artifacts that no one would claim to find interesting because of their excellence. I will focus today mostly on a defense of the long ago, not because I have no interest in the far away. Far from it. In the age of globalization, the message that we need a cosmopolitan education has been widely accepted, both here in Canada and around the world. What that means, I think, is that we must be prepared for conversation across societies if we are to build a world of peaceful and pleasurable cohabitation. But even without that political reason for a cosmopolitan education, there are surely intellectual reasons as well. Much of the art that we most value, for example, especially much of the art that we've seen produced in the last century or so, can be understood only in a wider context of cultures. Consider, let me be banal, Picasso. Famously, he took inspiration from a Vili mask from the Congo, shown to him in Paris, he of course not being French but Spanish, shown to him in Paris by an American, Gertrude Stein. And inspired by it, he helped create a new form of art which has traveled the world, providing inspiration today to many people, including to many contemporary African painters. How helpful, given these facts, is it to see Picasso as a Spanish painter, or even as a European one? That circulation is essential to the life of the kind of art we care about is obvious. It's essential, obviously, to literature as well. The first great history of English literature was written by a Frenchman, Hippolyte Taine. Taine had a terrible time trying to tell the history of English literature in the national framework, because all the people you immediately think of as the geniuses of that tradition are people who are profoundly conscious of, interacting with, inspired by literary art from other places. Shakespeare is inspired by Italian sonnets and by stories from Greece and Rome. One of Goethe's greatest lyric, sorry, my thing suddenly leapt somewhere. To get back to Goethe. Here we are. One of Goethe's greatest poetry cycles is called the Westöstliche Divan, divan being, of course, a Persian word. He was inspired by the Persian poet Hafiz, whose tomb is still a place of cultural pilgrimage for Iranians, in spite of the fact that he had a joyful Sufi spirit of a sort not popular with today's dreary ayatollahs. I take the importance of being globally, broadly educated to be part of the consensus of the sane. So today, as I say, I aim to discuss largely what we learned from the humanities' insistence on the continuing relevance of the past, though faraway things will appear from time to time. Let me start by just exemplifying the continuing utility of a humanistic education. The word humanities elicits from the random recesses of my own memory a passage from the beginning of Cicero's oration in defense of Archias, the poet, a passage I once had to learn by heart. The issue in the case was whether the poet who had been born in Antioch was, in fact, then a Roman citizen. And here's a rough translation of one of those endless Ciceronian sentences. For when Archias first left boyhood and turned from those arts by which young boys are gradually molded ad humanitatem, he devoted himself to the study of writing. First of all at Antioch, for he was born there in a noble place, which was formerly a famous and rich city, abundant in the most learned men and the most liberal studies. And there he succeeded speedily in showing himself superior to all in talent and fame. Now, I left the phrase ad humanitatem untranslated for the moment because I want to point to another passage just a little earlier where the same phrase occurs. In truth, all the arts which are relevant ad humanitatem have something in common which links them and are, as it were, connected by a certain kinship to one another. Now, Cicero uses the word humanitas a great deal. Lewis and Short, in the Latin dictionary, in their first sense for the word humanitas, give a gloss and then say, in parenthesis, mostly in Cicero. That's in the dictionary. In Proarchia, when he's asking the court to permit him more freedom than usual in the manner of his speech, he flatters the jury by speaking of this concourse of the most highly educated men with this humanitas of yours. In a passage later, he addresses the judges again, and he says, let this name of poet, therefore, judges, be holy among you, the most humane, humanissimos, of men, a name that none, not even barbarians, have defiled. Now, it's true that humanitas can mean just human nature or humanity in that sense, but it's clear enough that what Cicero has in mind when he says ad humanitatem is a second sense of the term. I might as well quote Lewis and Short. Mental cultivation befitting a man, presumably or woman, liberal education, good breeding, elegance of manners or language, refinement. And picking up the mention of a liberal education, let's remember the other phrase that goes with humanities, the liberal arts. Cicero, recall, refers to these when he says of Archias' native city of Antioch that it was liberalissimisque studiis ad fluenti, rich in the most liberal studies. The studia liberales were studies or enthusiasms or endeavors befitting a freeman. When Cicero speaks of Archias' boyhood education as having molded him ad humanitatem, he must mean that it had provided him with an upbringing befitting a gentleman, a free man. And he must have understood that such an education would produce a kind of cultivation and refinement eminently worth having. Now, we're rightly suspicious these days of these ways of marking distinction because they refer to the contrast between free people and slaves, between gentlemen and what Hazlitt's contemporaries would have called the lower orders. So if, as poor Pierre Bourdieu argued, the function of humane or literary cultivation was just to mark us off from the vulgar, then the humanities, conceived this way, would aim at an undemocratic end we, or let me speak for myself here, I, would not endorse. But Bourdieu's thesis is not something I'm even slightly inclined to accept. That a humane education can permit you to show off, I don't want to deny. So can long practice in golf, but that is hardly the best argument against golfing. The reason that I have no difficulty in defending the idea of the humanities as an education for free men and women is that one of the great achievements of the modern world has been to establish a global census that every human being ought to be free. In that sense, the central dogma of liberalism, that individuals are all entitled to lives of their own, lives in which the vital shaping decisions are for them to take and not to be settled for them by a master, is increasingly the common property of the species. If you doubt me, you have only to listen to the voices on the streets of Cairo, of Tunis, of Damascus and Sana'a, or read the impassioned essays of Wole Soyinka or Liu Xiaobo. And if you are to discharge this terrific responsibility of making your own, your only life, you surely need all the help you can get. So why does an education in the humanities, an education ad humanitatem, provide some of the help you need? After all, you might think that what you actually need is to be found again in the sciences. Psychology, especially the new so-called positive psychology, and neuroscience can tell you what it takes for a normal person to achieve satisfaction. Economics and political science help you think about what effects of various public policies will be. Physics and chemistry and biology tell us how the world works so that we can take what we want from it, or learn that we can't get what we want from it. These things are all true. But how will you learn which satisfactions are really worth having? Which effects are worth aiming for? What is worth wanting? Who will help you decide whether John Stuart Mill was right to say in his utilitarianism, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a satisfied fool? Indeed, who will let you know that that question is worth asking? And where will you learn that one reason for studying the sciences is that understanding how the universe works, understanding where we fit into it, would be worthwhile in itself, even if we could never put the knowledge to use in making a buck? Well, you and I know the answer to these rhetorical questions. These are the questions you learn to face, learn to live with, learn in the end, provisionally at least, to answer with the help of literature and the arts critically appreciated through the study of philosophy and history and cultural anthropology. Now, I realize that saying these things in this, no doubt, sympathetic company is liable to sound like Polonius rattling platitudinously on. And you may feel that the proper response is Laertes' response to that speech, which is humbly to take your leave. So let me make what I hope is a less obvious and familiar set of points. The humanities aren't just different from the sciences in providing us with a different kind of guidance in the making of our lives. They're different also in several profound ways in the character of their aims and their focus. Here are three such crucial distinctions which are connected, as I'll argue. First, while generalizations like the famous great vowel shift from Anglo-Saxon to Middle English, which comes immediately to mind, have been discovered in the humanities, in this case by philologists, they're put to use in our studies to illuminate particular things. The universal in the humanities is in the service of the particular to offer a formula. And this is, of course, because of the deeply ideographic character of much humanistic work. We study particular poems, particular paintings, particular sonatas, particular rap songs. Each is a worthy object of study, not just because it reveals something about poetry or painting or music or more generally about art or more abstractly yet about the human spirit, but because it is in itself worth explicating. Natural scientists are not interested in individual things, this atom, this collection of molecules, this organism, this cell, this strand of DNA. They're interested in what they instantiate. They're driven by the nomothetic urge, the urge to discover general patterns. That's why White's Natural History of Selborne, though full of acute observations on the natural world surrounding an English village, is not a scientific work, even if it contains reports that a scientist might have a use for. I was reminded of White's Natural History of Selborne because I reread Middlemarch last weekend, and she refers to it. It's also why Darwin's Origin of Species repays our attention, even though it is no longer by any stretch of the imagination the best scientific account of its subject. This contrast between our ideographic interests and the nomothetic urges of the social and natural sciences is connected with a second contrast, which has to do with the point of attention to these particulars that concern us. Our aim is centrally to explicate, that is, to account for the meaning, the significance, the symbolic working, if you like, of these particulars. Narrative as a form of explication or exegesis is one form of as a form of exegesis is one form of explication. Tell the story that explains what the thing is. But the explication has many other modes. One is the placing of a sign within a system of rules, prosodic rules, formal rules, semantic rules, aesthetic norms. And of course, not any explication of any humanly made thing is central to the project of the humanities, because there are too many particulars to be interested in all of them. We pick among them. And this is my third difference, we pick the ones that are significant for certain kinds of human purposes. Now, human purposes evolve and cannot be catalogued in advance. Tempora mutantur, nos et mutamur in illis. But whereas one E. coli will do as well as another for a biological study, as long as it has the right genome, not any old pot or painting or verse is worthy of sustained attention. There's an answer to the question why there are more essays on Rembrandt's paintings than on Ruysdael's, accomplished as the latter no doubt was. A reason why Mozart's work has achieved more attention than Salieri's, a significance to the greater attention paid to Jane Austen than to Mrs. Gaskell. And the point is not that Ruysdael and Salieri and Gaskell are insignificant people. The point is that we discriminate among these significant people and their works. So one thing a humane education teaches you is some of the reasons for these evaluations. So the world of the humanist, I think, is intrinsically tied up with the complex evaluations that underlie these differentiated patterns of attention. Now we know that bias of many kinds on account of class and nation and race and religion and gender, and we know as well that shifts of taste from, say, Puritan austerity to Baroque elaboration are part of the history of the humanities and what they study. But the point of what we do presupposes in the end that what we choose to study and teach is worth teaching because the understanding that is the product of our study enriches us as it enriches the lives of those to whom we pass it on. Hazlitt's recognition that the arts were not progressive is right, I believe, not because, as he thought, the arts are not, as he said, reducible to rule. The real phenomenon he was noting was this, that among the particulars worthy of our present attention, among the objects worth passing on, are many from remote times, while the scientific theory of remote times is of no contemporary scientific interest. And that is an important truth. But, notice, ancient science can be an object of humanistic study because we are interested in those ancient theories in the way in which we are interested in ancient art and ancient literature, because an understanding of them enriches us now, whether or not the theories are reliable guides to reality. We don't read Hawthorne because we think he's right about how we should live. That's why Heraclitus and Locke and Goethe and Darwin and Freud are of continuing humanistic interest. If you were driven by the nomothetic urge, you would study them only for general truths about the human mind, truths they instantiate. But most of what we learn about the human mind in a general way from the study of old medical or psychological or biological theories could be learned from the study of contemporary mentalities. If you're in the nomothetic mode, one theory, like one E. coli colony, will do just as well as any other. Our practice, on the other hand, is based on the faith that it's worth passing on an understanding of the intellectual, literary, and artistic practices of our predecessors and of people from other places, even when their theories have been shown to be scientifically untenable, even when we have no interest in reproducing their arts or their poems. We pass them on because without this knowledge, the objects worth attending to are not intelligible. They can't be explicated, absorbed, responded to in the ways that matter. It's a wonderful thing to be able to communicate the power, intelligence, and pathos of a Horatian ode. The pathos, for example, of the fact that exegi monumentum aere perennius, built a monument more enduring than bronze, is true, because the bronze memorials of Horace's day are indeed few and far between, and yet we still have scores of his poems. Nevertheless, the writing of a new ode in his style would be a mere curiosity. Another instantiation of the general form wouldn't be at all interesting. What this means for the future of the humanities is simple enough. Unlike the nomothetes, we'll always be holding on to the past because we hold the faith that much of what was done in the past is worth understanding for its own sake, not because it explains the present, not because it illuminates the universal, and because it is worth understanding, it is worth passing on. Ethics, which is in the hand of philosophers like myself, among others, teaches us that a worthwhile life has to contain things worth doing. But that one thing worth doing is attending to these artifacts is a lesson learned by anyone who has been well taught in the humanities. And that means that the humanities are intrinsically connected with teaching in a way that I think the sciences are not. To make these objects intelligible, we must teach their context, their systems of significance, the rules and the rule-breaking that made them. That's what makes them capable of explication. Our study of them is connected with the need to understand them, but the need to understand them depends on the conviction that they're worth holding on to and passing on. Science does two kinds of work for us. It delivers understanding, and it enables technological progress, and of course produces some technological peril. That understanding of the laws of our world is, like humanistic understanding, a thing of intrinsic value, something that would be worth having even if it didn't deliver a technological payoff. You're enriched by understanding the best contemporary scientific picture of the world. But you can be grateful to the scientists even if you don't know their story because of the great technological yield of modern science. Now, the humanities, one should admit, even though we don't do this perhaps often enough, certainly have utilitarian benefits too. Well-trained English literature majors write better memos and movie scripts than most badly trained ones, and certainly than those who have no training at all. And certainly those who have not learned to read deeply and well are less use in many practical contexts. And the theory and practice of composition, for example, play a central role in producing a society that communicates and creates with power and efficiency. Training in history helps you think as a citizen about the present and the future, and so makes you a better citizen. All that's true. But the heart of what we humanists do lives or dies, unlike the work of the experimental sciences, by whether we communicate what we do to each generation of students, persuading them that these particulars whose understanding we profess are worthy objects of their contemporary attention. They can be persuaded that some of the music and movies and television of our own era is worth attending to, and once persuaded of this, it's not too hard to show them that this requires more than merely passively absorbing them. And many of these present objects draw out humanistic attention in exactly the way that an ode of Horace or an illuminated manuscript or a Bach chorale might do. But it's harder to persuade many students today of the virtues of the older objects. And my own view, as I've been trying to suggest, is that persuading them of this is an essential part of the vocation of the humanist. We have to speak to non-specialists because we have to speak to the untrained young. I'm reminded of one of Harold Bloom's many aphorisms. They say we should not speak ill of the dead, but if we do not, who will? And if our faith is warranted, then what we have to offer to them is something to take on into their lives beyond college and to sustain them in their world and not just in their work. I am all for new methods and new questions, but they are in the service of a mission that is as old as formal education, to provide each new generation with the frameworks of understanding that will allow them to interpret a significant number of the many particulars that are our human heritage. Now, that significant number, as a moment's reflection reminds us, is a diminishing proportion of what there is to explicate. We can understand less and less of what there is because there's more and more of it. When I was an undergraduate, a teacher gave me a chromolithograph of one of Carpaccio's great murals, one that is called The Vision of St. Jerome. It's actually a picture of St. Augustine, but that's another story. Years later, looking at the original painting for the first time in Venice, it struck me that the shelf of books behind the saint contained most of the ones that he would have thought worth reading, and that he would have read all of them. When the scriptorium was replaced by the printing press, one of the limiting steps in the proliferation of writing was almost removed, and when the internet became available, the barriers came down completely. Now, each week here in Fredericton, thousands of times the number of pages that St. Jerome could have read in his lifetime are printed on paper. Millions of times that number will appear on the web. Once, to hear the range of music that I can scan in a few minutes on my car radio, I would have had to have traveled thousands of miles and been lucky to arrive for the right performances. The DVDs in my own house, never mind the films I can access through Netflix, contain more hours of human acting than Pepys or Aubrey, devoted theatre goers, both of them, ever saw in their entire lives. We are, in short, drowning in the particulars we humanists study. And that means that now, in this time, it's more urgent than ever to speak what is finest in this great flood of artifacts, so that those whom we can persuade to care for the magnificent particulars will spend the little time each of us has to attend to them well. In this time more than in any earlier time, and this will be more true tomorrow. The civilization we live in needs the work of the humanist. If the evidence is increasingly that our fellow citizens doubt this, that is our fault, because teaching this need and responding to it is our vocation. Now, there are extraordinary new tools for that project available to us now. When I sat down to write this talk, I had P.P. Howe's excellent edition of the works of Hazlitt to hand because it's part of our library at home. But you don't need to acquire this rare commodity. It took us many years to find it, because so much of Hazlitt is on the web. Not yet P.P. Howe, unfortunately, so somebody should work on that. I could check on the Latin that I remember from my youth because of the Perseus website, which you all know. You can read these things almost anywhere on the planet. We have so much more to read, yes, but we also have, and we need to develop, more tools for finding things to read, more, in the jargon, metadata that helps us scan the gigabytes or the terabytes for the kilobyte we need now. And one thing we need is a richer store of materials in other traditions, more texts in Africa's hundreds of languages, for example, along with the dictionaries and grammars for those of us who don't speak them, to begin to make sense of them. And if you wanted to know why they should be there, I should direct you to one of the sententiae left to us from the plays of Terence, P. Terentius Afer, the African, the Roman comedian of Berber ancestry, a line that Montaigne helped make famous later by inscribing it on the beams of his study. Homo sum humani a me nihil alienum puto. Now, it doesn't matter that in the Self-Tormentor, the play from which this comes, this line is actually an excuse for gossip, because this claim that nothing human is alien to us because we are human has become one of the great cosmopolitan slogans of humanism. And if it's the particulars that our distinctive contribution lie in, let me exemplify their power in the writer I just mentioned. In February 1571, on his 38th birthday, a one-time lawyer and courtier had a Latin inscription incised on the beam of his study. It went roughly like this: "Worn out with the slavery of the court and of public service, Michel de Montaigne retires to the bosom of the learned muses to pass what may be left of a life already more than half spent, consecrating this ancestral dwelling and sweet retreat to his liberty, tranquility, and repose." The plan was to hunker down at the Dordogne Chateau where he grew up. And the sweetest part of the retreat for him was this library, vast for its time, of more than 1,000 books. Soon he began to write the prose pieces in French, that he was to call the essays. Now, in the French of Montaigne's day, we should recall the word essay meant something, as we would say in English, assayed or essayed, an experiment, a tasting. Certainly, there'd never been anything in literature like these essays before, so the experiment paid off. It, as it were, tasted good. But it was a pretty strange experiment. One of his essays, on some verses from Virgil, begins with the annoyances of aging. Many pages in, he announces that the essay has a theme, which up until then has not been clear. He says, "What has the act of generation done to men, that this action so natural, so necessary, and so just, that we dare not speak of it without shame?" That leads us, via the passage of Virgil, which is about marital sex between Venus and Vulcan, to a discussion of sex and marriage more generally. Before long, Montaigne is bemoaning the inadequacy of his own sexual endowment. Now, Montaigne ends what he himself calls this river of Babel by remarking that men and women are cast in the same mold, except for what is due to education and customs. So this essay is about as linear as a series of blog posts. Montaigne knows he tends to free associate because one of his most frequent tics is to say some version of "let me get back to the subject." But the essays do have a certain consistency of outlook, and Montaigne's perspective was as novel as his style. In fact, Montaigne has a fair claim to being the first liberal. Montaigne's home was on the edge of hills that stretched northwards towards Limousin. So we could say the first liberal was almost a Limousin liberal. Liberalism, as I said earlier, has at its heart the idea of a free man and woman. What's important, liberalism holds, to put it the other way around, is whatever is important about not being unfree, about not being a slave or a client, a dependent. I suggested that one thing that matters is being in charge of the making of your own life. In the spirit of John Stuart Mill, we could call that individuality. The real individual, isn't a slave to a master, but is also not a slave to a government, and not a slave to public opinion. Mill, you'll recall, worried that the opinions of masses of merely average men are everywhere becoming the dominant power, and he wanted all of us to resist that tendency. So liberalism has both the doctrine that all people should be free and an interpretation of what freedom is and why it matters. But he also has at its core two habits of mind, an abhorrence of cruelty and a sense of the provisional nature of human knowledge, and these tendencies of thought are everywhere evident in Montaigne's sensibility. It's worthwhile remembering how distinctive this was. He was surrounded by religious strife that raged through his adult life, including the famous massacre of St. Bartholomew's, when thousands, no one knows exactly how many, were massacred in Paris and the provinces. So Montaigne was urging toleration at a time when you could be burned at the stake for an error in theology. He said it's putting one's conjectures at a rather high price to burn a man for them alive, taking aim in a single shot at overconfidence and at cruelty, which he once termed the ultimate of the vices. Judith Sklar, the great theorist of liberalism, suggested why the two, abhorrence of cruelty and sense of our own limitations, are more than contingently related. To hold cruelty to be the first of vices, she says, is to turn from the way revealed religion understands sin as offenses against God. That's easier if you can entertain the possibility that your religious convictions are wrong. To call something cruel, Sklar says, is to make, quote, a purely human verdict upon human conduct, and so puts religion at a certain distance. Fittingly, Montaigne's response to cruelty was visceral before it was theoretical. For all his vaunted egoism, he had a gift for putting himself in the shoes of another man, or sometimes of another animal. He also had a gift for accepting that his guesses were merely guesses. People often say that Montaigne and Descartes are the first modern philosophical skeptics, but in Montaigne, skepticism isn't a thesis, it's an attitude. If you wanted to label the position, you could better say that Montaigne is a fallibilist. He believes we must always bear in mind our own endless capacity for error. Discussing the long-standing debates between geocentric and heliocentric astronomy, he writes, in a characteristic moment, "Who knows whether a third opinion 1,000 years from now may overthrow the two former?" Thus, of course, anticipating Einstein's theory of relativity, which turned up sooner than 1,000 years later. These aspects of Montaigne's temperament, his horror of cruelty and his fallibilism, are ones from which we can still learn. They are liberal, like the studies of Archias's Antioch, because they are part of the temperamental equipment of a free woman or man, someone who aims to live at peace among a free people. We learn these things well from Montaigne because he coaxes, I would almost say, seduces us into that vision. The particulars of the essays are worth attending to in their own right, I say, but that's not to deny, as I'm also insisting, that coming to know them has many other advantages. And these powerful lessons about the best way for men and women to live together as free people are among the benefits. But the reasons why the particulars are worth attending to, and the consequential benefits of the attention, are not just one, they are many, as are the tools that enable you to guide your attention. That's why the case for the humanities is not one, but many-stranded, and why it is learned best through doing what we do, attending to those many things we can claim demand the attention of free men and women. And so there are indefinitely many stories that go with the myriad ways in which a humane education prepares you for a human life. Let me offer, in closing, just one more. In 1911, Harold, the only son of George Hamlin Fitch, book columnist of the San Francisco Chronicle, died suddenly while still a young man. Quote, "When this close and tender association," Fitch wrote, "was broken by death, swift and wholly unexpected, as a bolt from cloudless skies, it seemed to me for a few hours as if the keystone of the arch of my life had fallen and everything lay heaped in ugly ruin." End quote. Other men would have gone on a bender or binged on movies or jumped off a bridge. But the immediate response of this bookish man to the greatest tragedy of his life was to seek solace in the literary tradition that he had spent his professional life commending to others. The works on Fitch's list are familiar, if slightly old-fashioned. The Bible, Shakespeare, ancient Greek and Latin classics from the Iliad to Marcus Aurelius, the Arabian Nights, the Nibelungenlied, Augustine's Confessions, Don Quixote, Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, The Divine Comedy, Paradise Lost, Pilgrim's Progress, Boswell's Johnson, Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Tales. It's certainly only a very small slice of the world's works worth reading, and his actual commentary is even less likely to secure the agreement of contemporary critics than Hazlitt's. But I find myself moved as I think of this man facing a terrible loss, seeking consolation through these classics. The book he wrote was called Comfort Found in Good Old Books. And here are the opening words of his first chapter. For the 30 years that I've spoken weekly to many hundreds of readers of the Chronicle through its book review columns, it's been my constant aim to preach the doctrine of the importance of cultivating the habit of reading good books as the chief resource in time of trouble or sickness. This doctrine I enforced because for many years reading has been my principal recreation, and I have proved its usefulness in broadening one's view of life and in storing up material from the world's greatest writers, which can be recalled at will. But it never occurred to me that this habit would finally come to mean the only thing that makes life worth living. We humanists can promise our students this. If we work together successfully, an education in the humanities will equip you not only with a deeper understanding of what makes life worth living, but also with tools to enrich your life through continuing reflection on some of the multifarious particulars that are our common human birthright. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. My name is Graham Carr. I'm president of the Canadian Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And we have about 15 minutes for a question period. Il y a des micros à chaque côté de la salle. Si vous voulez poser des questions, please use the microphones. I think that was a tremendously stimulating talk, and there are many points of entry into it. But I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about is the way in which concepts like values and discrimination and worth recurred in the case for the humanities that you made, and the importance of teaching and being able to communicate the necessity to establish values, etc. But I'm wondering to what extent the case for the humanities is historically situated rather than timeless and enduring. And if you had any observations you want to make about that.
Well, so I think, oops, this is kind of loud. Yes, it has to be, I mean, as any humanist would tell you, it has to, the case is different as as society changes. Montaigne's humanism is the humanism of an aristocrat in a society in which most people couldn't read, and many people couldn't, where he lived, couldn't even speak French, the language of the government. So that obviously, and certainly couldn't read the Latin that he could read, and the Greek that he said he couldn't read very well. So that's an important thing. I mean, in a democratic society, the significance of this kind of humane learning seems to me radically democratized. That is, and therefore the function of attention to these things in the lives of the free citizens of democratic societies is a function that it has for all of them, not just for an elite, and that informs more fully the life of the society as a whole, because the life of the society as a whole is a conversation among all citizens and not dominated by the conversation of a very few. So that's one important difference. Another, I think, is the one that I mentioned in passing, which is that, has to do with, as it were, what the objects are. I mean, art historians develop specific skills because, not just general skills, they develop skills in approaching painting, in approaching the plastic arts, in approaching modern conceptual art, and so on. You have to develop particular skills. So, fortiori, you're going to have to develop specific skills which are dependent upon the character of the object of study. And we have all these new objects of study. I mean, we've had movies for a century. We have a very important part of our civilization now communicates with itself through television fiction. And interestingly enough, it seems to me what's happened is that we've never taken anything away. People still write poems and short stories and novels and essays and so on. They still get printed in books, but now they get dissemination in other ways. We have new forms of media, but all the old forms of media are still there. And I think, so that makes a difference. It makes a difference first because you have to develop skills in the interpretation of television that are specific to the character of television. You have to understand how television is made. You have to understand the difference between television in which writers are the central figures and movies in which directors and producers are. Right? These are differences that make a difference to how these forms work. And those differences are specific to particular societies. In some societies, there's these modern moving image media are very much a public thing, and in others, they're very much a private thing, and so on. All of those things matter, and so the character of the object always makes a difference to what you need to know in order to attend to it properly, and the character of the society in which the objects are being attended to makes a difference. And since both of those change, you will have to, make... What I was trying to suggest, I suppose, is that you can't give the general answer. You can't say what makes it worth studying the humanities, because what you learn is that what is valuable in the interpretation of poetry is different from what is valuable in a reading of Aristotle's natural history, his biological writings. So, sorry, gone on too long.
No, you haven't gone on too long. Please feel free to ask questions. Perhaps I could just ask you all to identify yourselves too beforehand.
James Skidmore from the University of Waterloo. I think most of us are convinced of the argument of the worth of teaching the humanities. I'm wondering, are we teaching them well enough? Are we doing a good enough job in how we teach the humanities? Are the objects that we study and the time and effort we put into certain aspects of what we study, is that what we need to be doing in our society? Is that what our students need to know? The reason I ask that is because in Canada, elsewhere too, of course, but in Canada, universities seem to be under increasing pressure from the public to be a certain way, whatever that might be. There are different aspects of that. But there's a general kind of criticism of universities. Are they worthwhile? Are they doing what they should be doing? And the fact is, most of the people doing that criticism are people who've studied at universities. They've been in our classes, and they've come to our programs, and they've studied with us, and they leave with that level of dissatisfaction. Now, that's a generalization. We can, of course, get into specifics. But so that's the root of that question. Are we doing, or is what we do worthwhile? Yes. But is how we're doing it the right way to be doing it, or should we be thinking about that? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we should always be thinking about that, yes. We should always be thinking about whether we're, the arts may not be progressive, as Hazlitt said, but that doesn't mean that particular arts can't get better. and the pedagogical arts can be, obviously, improved. I think you say rightly that many of the critics of higher education, especially humanities higher education, are the products of it. I think we should be pleased by that, especially if they do a good job, because it shows that we've given them the tools to think about the questions. We may not agree with their answers, but if teaching isn't about producing people who agree with you, it's about getting people who can make up their own mind intelligently about the questions that you want to talk about. So, yeah, I'm sure, and what we need to do better, though, is not something about which it's very easy to generalize, because the humanities are conducted in a set of globally, in a set of largely nationally based institutions, which are very different from one another, even though there are dialogues among scholars in Istanbul and Karachi and Shanghai with scholars in Lagos and Accra and Cape Town and Paris and London and so on. And they're doing, though there is a global conversation, which is an interesting fact in itself, given the diversity of the institutions, and I'm very pleased by that. Sort of what's going on in particular places is very different, and in North America, even in Canada, which I think has a less differentiated tertiary education system than the United States because it has less private funding. Even here, I think all the university administrators are nodding their heads. There's an enormous variation in institutions, and therefore, many different things going on and many different things to be said. And I think that while it's good, especially through the learned societies, that we talk to one another about what we're doing, we need to talk to one another with a clear awareness that we're doing it in very different contexts, and that therefore these questions about the social meaning of what we're doing and the content of what we're doing, work differently in different places. So when people make generalized attacks on the humanities, I think they must be wrong, but that means that we can't make generalized defenses either, except at this sort of meta level of pointing out that what we're defending is a practice of teaching people how to attend to these things that we aim to persuade them are worth attending to, from the vast range of things that you could attend to. And that the point of the, attending to the Carpaccio image is that there have been societies and times when people could, as it were, master most of what their society had available of the things worth thinking about, and they didn't know much about anybody else's. We are every day producing more stuff than any human being can study, and we're more aware of the fact that that's going on in many societies, and many of the processes of production aren't based in one society, but are the result of interactions across societies. And so that sense of the Bloom talks about this partly under the concept of belatedness, that sense that we've arrived very late in a vast game that's been going on for a very long time, and where nobody can master all the rules, right? That's a sense you have, I think, facing our context. And in that context, humanists have a lot to offer, because we help people discriminate. We help people find, in the Great Flood, some things to use in their lives.
We'll take a question on this side of the room and then come back to my left.
Hi there.
Hi.
Laura Servage from the University of Alberta. In my heart of hearts, I want to concur with your assessment of Bourdieu. But I really wonder about the limits of what we can do in education institutions and of pedagogy in general. I probably have to harken back to teaching a grade 11 English class and trying to persuade a group of 15-year-old boys who wanted to be mechanics when they grew up why they should take an interest in poetry, and kind of hitting the wall with that. So there's a tendency, I think, to put a lot of responsibility on our institutions, both at the K-12 and post-secondary levels to achieve this appreciation of the humanities. And I just wonder if you might comment on whether you perceive limits in what we can do as educators, and if there are limits, how do we respond constructively to those?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, yes, there must be limits. In the course of my own education, I hit some limits too. I wasn't able to teach myself Greek. And some people can. It just turns out to be, that's just a feature of me. It's a limitation of mine. So yes, and I think, frankly, coming into that class with the mandate of persuading them that they should be studying poetry might not have been the wisest move on the part of the people who sent you there. It might have been better to think with the students about what it was in language that they did already grasp they needed help in understanding and appreciating. And if you can, once you get there, with many people, including people who want to be mechanics, then it's actually only a series of steps. to poetry, in my view. But I think in teaching that the trick is to, as it were, start with people where they are, and not do what that peasant in the old Irish joke does, which is when you ask him what the way is to Dublin, he says, well, I wouldn't start from here. I think you should always start with people where they are, and they're in different places. And that's one of the reasons why sort of local, the history of the modern state is to a significant extent the history of attempts to uniformitize education, to create a public, a national public that speaks the same language and knows the same things. And I don't need to tell Canadians that. So it's, for many reasons, I actually favor thinking of education as something produced by more local communities and more responsive to a kind of local conversation about what's going on. Not because I don't think in each of those local communities there shouldn't be global content, of course there should. But, you know, as I say, if you want to get people engaged, let's say, with the histories of other places than the ones you're in, why not start with the histories of the people who just arrived in the place that you're at, rather than sort of saying, oh, we have to teach global history. We could do it through thinking about the histories of those of us in the classroom, if you have a multinational classroom with immigrant elements, which you may not have, in which case you have to do something else. And I think there's a tendency, you know, I think we often forget that we had to learn to appreciate poetry. Well, maybe you don't, but my mother was a poet, and I was taught very young to read poetry and had it read to me. And I think you know, that's a process, and to be sort of plugged into that process at the age of 15 without any history, it's not surprising that it doesn't work. And so, yeah, I think we should be sensitive to where people actually are in education, and that's one reason why I think there's actually something to be said for less centralized education systems, even at the primary and secondary level.
Question over here.
Thank you very much. I'm Angelica Mazier-Lemieux from Montreal, Vanier College. The question I have is this. Your emphasis on critical knowledge, and circulation, study, and reflection was primarily important in the creation of free people who will live together as free people. And I'm wondering if it wasn't a very high level of abstraction that you presented this with, and that I find that the real question has to be who is making the decisions on the ground? And if we see comfort and retirement to reflect, are we not just prisoners of discursivity? Should not education lead to encouraging moral action? In other words, where is the emphasis on becoming a moral agent? People can sit around forever and a day talking and discussing, which is a luxury. And we do want other people to become free, to be able to discuss things. But I find that we could just become people in our armchairs at universities and colleges. And my question to you is, don't you feel there has to be a space in that humanistic education that encourages students and all of us to become moral agents in the creation of a world where we can live together actually as free people? Thank you.
Well, so I think you and I have a different picture of how people become moral agents, because I think the ways in which people largely learn how to interact in decent ways come from things other than the articulation of propositions about how to live decently with one another. So that the way we learn to live decently with one another is basically by doing. We learn to live decently with one another by interacting in decent ways. Human beings are designed in the sense in which Darwinism permits us to speak of design for social interaction, and normally raised children develop a sense of moral agency, even in very difficult circumstances. So I don't think that, so I would say it's not the function of people who produce discursive knowledge to, as it were, train people into moral habits. Now, what you said about moral agency suggested that you had in mind, in particular, a kind of political engagement. So here's my view for what it's worth about a free society. In a free society, one of the luxuries is that not everybody has to be politically engaged. And if that sounds conservative to you or unradical, I think it's actually quite a radical thought, in fact. And so, it's only when things are going really badly, as they were in Egypt earlier in this, over the last 50 years, then you have to think about politics in order to get things right in your own society. The questions of political agency that worry me in the world today, for those of us in the richest places, are mostly about our relation to people in poorer places, not about our relations with one another, even though I would be, of course, happier to have different people in the prime ministers and presidential offices in many of the countries in the democratic societies. So, I think, a person who has been prepared intellectually for the kind of free life that a humane education gives you has all the intellectual tools they need to be a decent citizen. Making them politically engaged, I just don't think, it's not clear to me that that's part of the task of the university or of the, as it were, learned professions. Not that I'm against it. I was going to go to China next week, and they've denied me a visa because I've been very active in support of human rights of people like Liu Xiaobo. So I'm perfectly happy to engage in these things, but I don't think of it as something that is intrinsically part of the task of the learned, period.
Thank you very much. I realize you've been very patient waiting, but unfortunately, I'm up against time constraints, so perhaps you can speak privately with Dr. Appiah afterward. Avant de remercier notre conférencier, professeur Appiah, je voudrais souligner l'appui, le support que nous avons reçu de la part de la Société royale du Canada en présentant cette causerie Voir Grand aujourd'hui. I hope and believe you will all agree with me, thinking back to William Hazlitt, the quotation at the beginning, that we have experienced a superior lecture and introduction to a week of thinking about the place of the humanities in society. And I would like to ask all of you to join me in offering a warm round of thanks to our guest, Dr. Anthony Appiah.